The Story of a Skow. While in the legislature, there was a bill before it for the creation of a county. The author of it wished to run for boundary lines so as to support his popularity. To this, the colonel was opposed because his interest was affected by it. They were hammering at it for some time. Whatever the author of the bill would affect my speaking, the colonel would only undo by log rolling, until the matter was drawn to a close, when he rose and made the following speech. Mr. Speaker, you do know what that man's bill reminds me of. Well, I suppose you don't, so I'll tell you. Well, Mr. Speaker, when I first come to this country, a blacksmith was a rare thing. But there happened to be one in my neighborhood. He had no striker, and whenever any of the neighbors wanted his work done, he had to go over and strike till the work was finished. These were hard times, Mr. Speaker, but we had to do the best we could. It happened that one of my neighbors wanted an axe, so he took along with him a piece of iron, and went over to the blacksmith's to strike it till the axe was done. The iron was heated, and the neighbor fell to work, and was striking nearly all day. And the blacksmith concluded the iron couldn't make an axe, but would make a fine mattock. So my neighbor, wanting a mattock, concluded they would go over and strike till his mattock was done. Accordingly, he went over the next day and worked faithfully. But towards night the blacksmith concluded his iron would make much of a mattock, but would make a fine plowshare. So my neighbor, wanting a plowshare, agreed that he would go over the next day and strike till he was done. Accordingly, he went over again, and fell hard to work, but towards night the blacksmith conducted the iron wouldn't make a plowshare, but would make a fine scow. So my neighbor, tired working, and cried and scow it would be, and the blacksmith was taking up the red-hot iron, threw it in a trough of water near him, and as it fell in, it sung out Skow. And this, Mr. Speaker, will be the way that man's bill for a county. He'll keep you there and doing nothing, and finally his bill will turn out to be a Skow. No mind if I'm doing it. Grinning the bark off a tree. That Colonel Crockett could avail himself, in electioneering, of the advantages of well-applied satire and service. The following anecdote won't sufficiently prove, though. In the canvass of the congressional election of 18, Mr. was the colonel's opponent, a gentleman of the most pleasing conciliating manners, who seldom addressed a person or company without wearing upon his countenance a particularly good-humored smile. The colonel, to counteract his influence of this winning attribute, thus concluded it would be a stump speech. Yes, gentlemen, he may get the votes by grinning, or he can out-grin me, and you know I ain't slow. And to prove to you that I'm not, I will tell you an anecdote. I was concerning myself, and I was fooled by a little bit of the wickedness. You all know I love hunting. Well, I discovered a long time ago that a coon couldn't stand my grin. I could bring one tumbling down from the highest tree. Never wasted powder and lead when I wanted one of the creatures. Well, as I was walking out one night, a couple 100 yards from my house, looking careless about me, I saw a coon planted upon one of the highest limbs of an old tree. The night was very moony and clear, and old Rattler was with me, but Rattler won't bark at a coon. He's a pretty dog in that way. So I thought I'd bring the lark down in the usual way, by a grin. I set myself, and after grinning at the coon a reasonable time, I found he couldn't come down. I wondered what was the reason. I took a steady grin at him, and he was still there. It made me a little mad, so I felt round and got an old limb about 5 feet long, and planting one end upon the ground, I placed my chin upon the other, and took a rest. I then grinned my best for about 5 minutes, but the cursed coon hung on. So finding I could not bring him down by grinning, I determined to have him, for I thought he must be a droll chap. I went over to the house, got my axe, and returned to the tree, saw the coon still there, and began to cut away. Down it come, and I ran forward, but damn, the coon was there to be seen. I found that what I had taken for one was a large knot upon a branch of the tree, and, upon looking at it closely, I saw that I had grinned all the bark off, and left the knot perfectly smooth. Now, fellow citizens, continued the colonel, you must be convinced that, in the grinning line, I myself am not slow. Yet when I look upon my opponent's countenance, I must admit that he is my superior. You must all admit it, therefore. Be wide awake, look sharp, do not let him grin you out of your boats. The Coonston Trick. Whilst on the subject of election matters, I will just relate a little anecdote about myself, which will show the people to the east how we manage things out here in the frontiers. It was when I first run for Congress. I was in the favor of the hero, Andrew Jackson, for he had chalked out of his course so sleek in his letter to the Tennessee legislature that, like Sam Patch says, there is no mistaking it, and so I went ahead. No one dreamt about the monster in the deposits at that time, so, as I afterward found, many, like myself, were taken in by these fair promises, which were worth as much as a flash in the pan when you have to fair shot at the fat bear. But I'm losing sight of my story. Well, I started off to the crossroads dressed in my hunting shirt and a rifle on my shoulder. Many of our constituents had assembled there to get a taste of the quality of the candidates that were orating. Job Snowden, a gander-shaped Yankee, who had been caught somewhere in the Plymouth Bay, had been shipped to the west with a cargo of codfish and rum, erected a large shanty, and set up shop for the occasion. A large posse of the voters had assembled before I had arrived, and my opponent had already made considerable headway with his speechifying in the street. And when they spotted me about with a rifle, shot from camp, and sauntering along as if I was not a party in business. "There comes Crockett," one cried. "Let us hear the colonel," said another. And so I mounted the stump that had been cut down for the occasion, and began to bushwhack in most approved style. It had not been long before there was such an uproar in the crowd that I could not hear my own voice, and some of the constituents let me know that they could not listen to me on such a dry subject as the welfare of the nation until they had something to drink, and that I must treat them. Accordingly, I jumped down from the rostrum and led the way to the shanty, followed by my constituents, shouting, "Huzzah for Crockett, and Crockett forever!" When we entered the shanty, Job was busy dealing out his rum in a style that showed he was making a good day's work of it. I called for a quart of the best, but the crooked critter returned no answer other than pointing to the board over the bar, on which said, in chalk in large letters, "Pay today, trust tomorrow." Now that idea brought me up all standing. It was a sort of concern in which there was no blackout and ready money in the West, and those times was the shyest thing of all nature, and it was most particularly shy with me on that occasion. The voters, seeing my predicament, fell off to the other side, and I was left deserted and alone, as a government will be when he no longer has any offices to bestow. I saw as plain as day that the tide of popular opinion was against me, and that unless I got some rum speedily, I would lose my election as sure as there were snakes in Virginia. And it must be done soon, or even burnt brandy wouldn't save me. So I walked away from the shanty, but in another guess sort of way I entered it. For on the occasion I had no train after me, and not a voice shouted "Huzzah for Crockett." Popularity sometimes depends on a very small matter indeed. In this particular, it was worth a quart of New England rum, and no more. Well, knowing that the crisis was at hand, I struck into the woods with my rifle on my shoulder, my best friend in the time of need, and as good as fortune would have it, it had not been in more than a quarter of an hour that I treed a fat coon, and pulling the trigger he lay dead on the foot of the tree. I soon whipped his hairy jacket off his back, and again bent my steps toward the shanty, and walked up to the bar, but not alone. This time I had half a dozen of my constituents at my heel. I threw down the coonskin upon the counter and called for a quart. And Job, though busy dealing rum out, forgot to point to his chalk rules and regulations, for he knew a coon was as good as legal tender for a quart of the West, and as New York showing in any day of the year. My constituents now flocked over to me, and cried, "Huzzah for Crockett, Crockett forever!" And finding the tide had taken a turn, I told them several yarns to get them in a good humor, and having soon dispatched the value of the coon, I went out and mounted a stump without opposition, and the clear majority of the voters followed to hear what I had to offer as good as a nation. Before I was half through with my constituents moved on so that they could hear the balance of my speech after they had washed down the first part with some more of Job Snowden's extract of cornstalk and molasses. And question been put, it was carried unanimously. It wasn't considered necessary to tell the yeas and nays, for we adjourned to the shanty, and on the way I began to reckon that the fate of the nation pretty much depended on my shooting another coon. While standing at the bar, feeling sort of bashful, while jobs, rules, and regulations staring at me in the face, I cast my eyes down to discover one end of the coonskin sticking out between the logs that supported the bar. Job had slung it there in a hurry of business. I gave a quick short jerk, and it followed up by hand as natural as if it had been the rightful owner. I slapped it on the counter, and Job, little dreaming he was barking up the wrong tree, shoved along another bottle, which my constituents quickly disposed of with great good humor, and some of them saw the trick, and then withdrew from the rostrum to discuss the affairs of the nation. I don't know how it was, but voters soon became dry again, and nothing would do but we must adjourn to the shanty. And as luck would have it, the coonskin was still sticking between the logs, as if Job had flung it there on purpose to tempt me. I was not slow in raising it to the counter, and the run followed, of course. I wish I had been shot if I didn't before that day was over. Get 10 quarts for the same identical skin, and from a fellow, too, who in those parts was considered as sharp as a steel trap, and as bright as a pewter button. The joke secured me my election, for it was calculated like smoking among my constituents, and they allowed, with one accord, the man who could get away with a whip job on hand-snelling fair trade could outwit old Nick himself, and was real grit for them in Congress. The job was by no means popular. He boasted of always being wide awake, and that anyone who could take him was free to do so, for he came from the stock that, sleeping or waking, he always had one eye open, and the other not more than half closed. The whole family were geniuses. His father was inventor of wooden nutmegs, and with Job said he'd have made a fortune, if he had only taken out a patent and kept the business in his own hands. His mother, Patience, manufactured the first white oak pumpkin seeds out of mammoth kind, and turned out a pretty penny for first season. And his Aunt Prudence was the first to discover that corn husks steeped in tobacco water would make a handsome Spanish wrappers for what came from Havana. And the oak leaves would answer all of the purpose for filling, and no one could discover the difference except the man who smoked them, and then it would be too late for him to make a stir about it. Job himself bragged of having made some useful discoveries, the most profitable of which was the art of converting mahogany sawdust with the cayenne pepper, which he said was profitable and safe business. For the people have been long accustomed to having brown dust in their eyes, and that there wasn't much danger in being found out. The way I got the blind side of Yankee merchant was pretty generally known from before Election Day, and the result was that my opponent might as well have whistled jigs in a milestone to attempt to beat up the votes for the district. I beat him out and out, fought back in the old year, and there was scarce enough left for him, after the canvass was over, to make a good grease spot. He disappeared without even leaving a mark behind, and such will be the fate of Adam Huntsman, if there's a fair fight, no gouging. After the election was over, I sent Snell the price of the rum, but took good care to keep the fact from the knowledge of my constituents. Job refused the money and sent me word that if it did him good to be taken in occasionally, it serves to brighten his ideas. But I afterwards learned, when he found out the trick had been played upon him, he put all the rum I had ordered on his bill against my opponent, who, being elated from speeches he had made in the affairs of the nation, could not descend to examine the particulars of a bill of a vendor of rum in a small way.